Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the North Door and Insurance Technology Forum webinar on security and the latest trends, threats, and risks. Now, firstly, I'd like to thank Brian at Insurance Tech Forum because he's been some sterling effort to get everyone together and provide us a great audience for what is clearly a very topical subject. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll hear from three speakers. Darren Craig is CEO of Risk Exchange, Adam Harrison, who's the European lead from IBM's X-Force organization, and Fran Howarth, who is the security practice lead at Bloor Research. And Fran will be hosting the Q&A sessions at the end of the presentation. Now, clearly, sometimes security questions can be confidential. So if anyone has an issue they wish to raise offline, we will be providing contact information at the end of the seminar. For over 30 years, North Door's been involved with the Lloyds of London insurance market. In fact, our name North Door comes from the North Door of the Lloyds market itself. We've focused mostly on data. We've used a strapline of store it, protect it, and use it. And the protect it piece is the area that we're discussing today because that's the piece that is causing people most concern. We've seen a real growth in security in what is an ever-increasing and complicated business arena. But what's been interesting is that over the past few months, we've seen a massively unplanned change in our working lives. We've been forced, admittedly, sometimes unwillingly, into remote working, often for the first time. We've had clients moving at haste from on-prem into cloud. And after an initial few weeks of difficulty, normal services have been resumed for the most. But what we have seen is an increasing activity into people looking to exploit the haste with which these transitions have taken place. Cyber attacks are up anywhere from 50 to 100%, depends upon which survey you read. Sizable organizations have declared breaches. So we've seen recent indications from Nintendo, from EasyJet, where confidential private information, credit card details, passport information has all been breached and leaked out to the hackers. And the issue is that whilst these breaches are initially embarrassing for organizations, they have started now to have significant effect on share price, on reputation, and we're starting to see now some class actions from legal companies looking to exploit those that have been breached and making significant financial impacts into those organizations. For individual organizations, it's often very difficult to know where to start. We've seen organizations putting in firewalls and as a first phase approach to these things, but equally important is it's not just you've got to worry about now, it's your supply chain. You need to protect your supply chain. You need to have a coordinated recovery plan from any breach or ransomware attack. And we're hoping now over the next 45 minutes to cover some of these aspects. It is an open forum. Please do feel you can ask questions. We'll gather them up and Fran will help to chair those at the end of the presentation. But it's, like I say, it's an open forum, so please feel free. And with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, Darren, the CEO at Risk Exchange, who will discuss cyber risk within the insurance industry.
Thanks, AJ. So I'll just switch my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. So good morning, everybody. My name's Darren Craig, CEO of Risk Exchange. And I'm going to spend probably the next 15, 20 minutes or so just talking about a piece of work that we did quite recently around an assessment of the UK insurance industry, which covered brokers, insurers, and carriers, etc. And I'm just going to sort of delve into a little bit of some of the interesting findings that we uncovered during that assessment. And we do plan to update this assessment again, probably in the next 3 months. So if anybody's interested in getting a copy of the original assessment paper, we can arrange that afterwards. And if you would like to register to receive any future ones, then we can also arrange that. So just moving forward then. So Risk Exchange itself, just a little bit of background. So Risk Exchange is a cybersecurity ratings platform, very, very similar to, you know, a credit rating, in the same way as you go and ask the bank for a loan or maybe some car finance or something like that. The first thing that would happen is you would be asked to complete an application form, effectively a risk assessment. And out would pop a rating which would dictate whether you would, you know, get that finance or not. In the same way, Risk Exchange carries out risk ratings of hundreds of thousands of companies every single day, right across the world. And we're able to then provide our customers with instant cyber risk rating scores for any one of those companies, or really any company, because we cover the whole internet. We scan the whole internet every single day. And what we do with that information, then we're able to provide it to our customers that they can use that to gain assurance potentially from their supply chain, rather than using spreadsheets and manual process, etc. But we also use our rating information to provide cybersecurity underwriters with again another set of data that they can use to make informed decisions. As well as that, then we also do provide the data to M&A activities, so they can do some due diligence around maybe target acquisition companies they're looking at. So anybody that's on this webinar today is able to receive a free Risk Exchange cyber risk rating for their particular company. Everyone that's on the webinar today's company has already been scored and is being scored on a daily basis. So that, again, that information is available afterwards if you would like to have a look at that a bit closer. So just to talk about the approach that we take with Risk Exchange. So what we do is we start to gather raw data and effectively map out the footprint of an organization, the digital footprint of an organization. So we map out their head office as well as their subsidiary companies. And included in this footprint would be things like their servers, their applications, any network flows, any network address information, etc. And we score all of this raw data effectively and give it a grade ranging from A to F. And then we gather these grades up and roll it up into a overall score, which can range from 300 to 900, 900 being optimum and excellent. And you know, what does this score tell us? It's interesting to look, and AJ mentioned EasyJet there, the EasyJet breach. This score, if an organization is scoring, you know, in around 5 to maybe early 600s, then, you know, there's certainly that risk of suffering some sort of cybersecurity breach event based on the information that we're uncovering. And we have clear validation of this against you know, the EasyJet breach recently, who was scoring below 500 at one point, and their score now thankfully has improved a little bit. But we also seen the same correlation with the British Airways breach. So again, we're happy to cover that in a lot more detail afterwards. But really, the score is really there to give you an indication of the current risk of that organization and whether they're doing the right things. You know, are they patching their servers on time? Are they configuring their applications? Have they been distributing malware, for example, from some of their public IP addresses? So there's a whole range of areas we collect data across, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But really, the goal here is to work with within your own teams, and also to work with your suppliers to you know, improve that score and maintain that score. Really is the hard bit. Getting up to a 700 to 800 range is possible, but the challenge is maintaining that and keeping on top of things. So, as I said at the beginning, we did carry out an assessment of the UK insurance industry. That was around 150 organisations, which covered insurance brokers, insurance cover holders, MGAs, as they're commonly referred to, and also the larger organisations, the carriers or the insurers themselves. And it's interesting to see that, none of the companies that we had a look at managed to achieve a score of 900. They were all below 800, which was a bit concerning, to be honest. But this pattern shows us here the carriers scoring a higher score than the brokers, and that's probably expected, to be honest, because these carriers are large organizations. They are investing a lot more in cybersecurity and information security, maybe more broadly. So we would expect to see a better score and better security posture coming back from these organizations. In the same way, it's not surprising that brokers are scoring down in a maximum of 758 in this case. So, and again, that's really related to their levels of investment. Brokers tend to be smaller organizations, and they tend to be, fragmented across a number of smaller offices, etc. And they tend not to sort of give cybersecurity the same priority as maybe some of the larger organizations. So again, it's not surprising, but it does highlight some worrying statistics, which I'll cover off. So when we look at the overall score between brokers, MGAs, and insurers, the key things that jumped out at us, and I'm not sure if you can see this graph, hopefully you can, but the key things that jumped out at us is only 5.5% of companies scored an A when it came to application security. Now this is pretty shocking, really, because really application security is one of the applications is one of the prime attack vectors we see hackers going after, because a lot of applications are maybe not developed securely. They're not they're deployed maybe not securely, so they tend to be an easy target for the bad guys, so to speak. But again, it looks like taking an average across all of these companies, there's only a very small percentage of organizations do seem to be doing the right things when it comes to application security. And more worryingly, there's 39% of companies are scoring a grade D. And really, what does this mean? This really means that there's a lot of applications out there among those 150 organizations that are really not giving the focus they need to when it comes to application security. And these can be very simple things. Like we did see a lot of organizations that are not, they have no encryption, for example, on their websites. That this is a basic requirement nowadays, even from Google. It's a requirement that you must have SSL certificates, encryption certificates on your website. And there was a large proportion of these organizations do not have any encryption. And really what that's doing is putting your the user's information, their customers' information at risk while they're transacting with that organization. And it certainly does indicate that some of these organizations are at risk of a security breach via some of the using some of these misconfigurations and bad deployments of applications. It's also interesting to note that 11.54% of MGAs and 38% of brokers and 26% of insurers scored an A when it comes to email security. So again, this is a bit of a mixed result here. We would expect all of these companies to be scoring, or certainly high, 80, 90% to be scoring an A when it comes to security, because the things that we look at are, in some ways, basic requirements, really. We look at, do they have DMARC installed, to protect against spoofing of email addresses, etc., or spoofing of their corporate domains when it comes to email. And again, this highlights to us that these organizations that haven't configured their email services correctly are at a very high risk of having their email domains used in spoofing attacks or phishing type attacks. So again, this is something that needs quite a bit of work. And again, when we look across all of the firms, we did see a percentage, 23% of organizations advertising database services to the public internet. And this is really, this is really not good practice. It's something that any security professional would advise against. Because the fact that they're advertising a database service, makes them a target effectively for somebody to take a deeper look. Is that database service running with default account credentials or with weak passwords? And we would always recommend that this database service is secure behind some sort of VPN with whitelist IP address behind their firewall, etc., so that it's not available to the open internet. And again, only 46% of organizations are using good encryption levels. As I mentioned, a lot of them don't have basic encryption on their websites, but a lot of them are using very weak encryption ciphers. So these things, again, some of these operating systems haven't been patched in a long time. And there could be operational reasons why that's the case. But again, these organizations we have uncovered definitely need to take a closer look at that. So when we start to break the data down into the brokers themselves, again, we find a couple of interesting things here. 33% of brokers scored an A when it comes to network security. And really what this means is that the brokers are not, they're not doing the correct level of firewalling. They're leaving open ports exposed, which shouldn't be exposed. They're using insecure protocols. One of the common things we see is FTP. And really that's, again, it's a best practice would dictate, and all frameworks, security frameworks would stipulate that you should never use FTP. You should always also be using SFTP, secure version of that, which is encrypted. So again, there's a lot of these types of services being exposed from the broker community. And also we uncovered a lot of brokers that are not patching these services correctly. So there's a lot of known vulnerabilities or common vulnerabilities that were discovered as part of the exercise, which is why these brokers were sort of returning low scores. And again, a similar sort of picture when it comes to email security. The brokers themselves aren't really investing in good email security and leaving themselves open to phishing attacks or spoofing type of email attacks. I mean, we look at the MGAs. So these are obviously slightly larger organizations. But none of the MGAs managed to score an A when it comes to application security. And the sort of things we see there are, very badly configured applications, poorly developed applications that don't have any form of encryption on their maybe forms, their login screens, or forms that they're asking I guess clients or potential clients to enter their personal data. So again, they're putting themselves at risk here of a breach of the GDPR, and they're not securing their clients' information while they're asking them to provide, maybe as part of an application or something like that. But again, quite shockingly, 85% of MGAs again do not have basic email security in place, and really. I think it's quite shocking in some ways that we were surprised to see this. We would have expected this to look a lot better from these slightly larger organizations. So when you get into the insurers, obviously the insurers themselves are larger organizations. They tend to have an allocated budget when it comes to security, different levels. Some invest more than others, but again. When we looked at the insurers themselves, we have identified that 75% of them are scoring an A when it comes to database security. So that's good. That's very, very good. And it's a contrast to the MGAs or the brokers themselves. So it shows that they are, investing in firewalling, being aware of what services they're advertising, knowing that they should not be publishing database services directly to the internet. But shockingly, only less than 1% of insurers scored an A when it came to application security. And really what this says to us that the insurers themselves appear to have focused very heavily on network security, which sort of more traditional, it's sort of commodity-based security nowadays, but they really haven't spent that much time, auditing or passing applications through any sort of security assessments, because some of the findings from this part of the assessment were quite basic. Some of the stuff we found, and things that can be resolved very, very quickly, really. But the important thing here is that these sort of misconfigurations are caught as part of the DevOps process, or part of that deployment process. They should never really get out onto the open internet. And again, unfortunately, that these basic issues are finding their way out, unfortunately. Oops. So okay. So just that was just a touch really of what we found. And as I said at the beginning, there's a lot more information we're happy to discuss in detail. And particularly around your organization, maybe if you wanted to find out a bit more about some of the detailed results from your organization and its current score. But I think all of the things we look at are cybersecurity related. They're all external things, but really a lot of these can be addressed by implementing a good cybersecurity framework like NIST. And what I've done here, provided a short list of things that really takeaways really that any organization should be taken on board as part of their security program. And I'm not going to go through all of these individually. It's really just as a takeaway. And I understand that these slides will be made available by Brian afterwards. So again, you're able to use these maybe as a starting point to look at some of these issues. But again, we're happy to have a one-to-one session to go into these in a lot more detail. Just to close out, we are having questions at the end, but for everyone on the call, as I said at the beginning, there is we look at your score, and there is a 30-day free trial for anyone in terms of using Risk Exchange. And this may not be just to look at your own organization. This may be a group of third parties that you're considering working with, or you are working with, and you're interested in understanding what their security rating looks like or their security posture looks like. But it also may be useful to look at in terms of providing additional data when it comes to cybersecurity underwriting. So with that, I'll hand back to AJ and let him introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Darren. I'd like to hand across to Adam now. Adam is the European lead for IBM's X-Force organization, and they're tasked with, well, he'll go into more detail, but a staggering number of breaches they track daily, weekly, and they're involved with manufacturers and developers of software way beyond before any of the breaches we typically see hit the industry. But Adam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, AJ, and indeed, thank you all for your time and attention. As stated, the name's Adam Harrison. I am the European lead for IBM's X-Force IRIS team. IRIS stands for Incident Response and Intelligence Services, and essentially we are the consulting incident response practice within IBM. So customers have us on retainer, or indeed, approach us ad hoc in the event that they suffer a data breach or an incident of some description, and we, through incident response expertise and digital forensics, help them get to the bottom of an incident that they've had occur. As you might expect, by virtue of that, we get a good level of visibility as to what's going on in the in the cybersecurity world and the types of incidents that our clients and the clients of partner organizations, organizations that we share information with, are suffering. And we use that information to both spot, identify trends, and to assist our customers. But also we summarize that information and publish it in a number of different guises to help organizations understand what we're seeing, what the threat landscape looks like, and essentially how to prepare as best as possible to deal with an incident of some description. Two of the ways in which we do that our major publication in this area are the cost of a data breach report, and a lot of the stats that I'll speak to in the first half of this presentation will relate to that, and also the X-Force Threat Intelligence Index. So the cost of a data breach report is our most long-standing publication. We've been producing that for about 14 years. We are overdue the 15th. It is going to drop very shortly. So apologies, timings-wise. That does mean some of the stats relate to, that we actually have on the slides will relate to the previous year's data. But ultimately, what we're really looking for there is not a year by year. It's the trends that we see over time. And so I'm going to dive into a few of those statistics, paint the picture, set the scene, as it were, as to what we're seeing in the threat landscape, and then take a slightly deeper dive, particularly into ransomware, a little bit of history of how that has evolved over time, and what we're seeing in the most prevalent and most damaging ransomware attacks as they are today. And the reason, as you might imagine, the reason we're focusing on ransomware is it is what is keeping IT security departments, CISOs and the likes up at night, because it is a very damaging and a threat which has great potential to cause harm to organizations, and is very prevalent, as we see as we look through the stats that we've got. The very high level stats and sort of the key things that were drawn out of the cost of a data breach report, the last one we produced, was the average total cost of a data breach has continued to go up, as it has done year on year. We're now looking at $3.92 million as the average cost. The average time to identify and contain a breach, again, has gone up. We have actually seen a little bit of back and forward in that particular stat, but it is a key one, particularly as we talk to the trends in ransomware, and that's one of the drivers here. Ransomware was something that brought this stat down because it's very visible. As soon as you've been compromised with ransomware, then the attackers are letting you know with pop-ups up on the screen or whatever it may be. But as I'll talk to later, what we're seeing is a trend for organizations to be breached for a period of time before ransomware is dropped, which of course is going to cause this stat to increase. And I expect to see another increase into next year's report. Top countries, as in dollar value of incidents, we have there the United States, Middle East and Germany as 1, 2 and 3. The UK follows up at 3.88 million, I think it is the average cost that we saw of the data breaches that we investigated. The greatest cost per record is, as you might expect, in the healthcare industry, so a highly regulated industry, and an industry where the target of attacks is likely to be breach of records, breach of PII, which is particularly sensitive. So there are fines associated with that, which of course create an additional cost for that. The financial services and insurance is the second highest industry cost per record after health. And the time it's taking to actually identify a breach, I alluded to earlier, we're talking about in excess of 9 months, to identify and then subsequently contain. So a breach is taking a long time to be detected in the first instance, and then subsequently taking a long time to contain, to recover from the actual incident itself. And what that means, as we see the impact on the stats, is those incidents with a longer dwell time, with a more extended recovery, and therefore recovery efforts that must have been required to drive that, are going to be more expensive, have a greater financial impact on the organization. As we look at the cost drivers, that which is actually making an incident expensive to organizations, one of the surprising stats, or not necessarily surprising if you followed it, but one that might be counterintuitive to many, is that lost business is the biggest cost driver. So when we're talking across all sectors, so if you think about a manufacturing plant or manufacturing business that's been impacted, their inability to do business for 30 days, whatever it may be, they have a cost per minute that could be astronomical. Likewise, if you can't serve your customers, you have an immediate impact on revenue, but then subsequently the trickle-down effect is a number of your customers who will possibly start looking to competitors. It's a number of customers who might have a different perception of you as an organization. So there is this trickle-on impact whereby costs are, not just being incurred directly and during the short term of an incident, but it definitely progresses through to a period of years ultimately, that businesses are seeing the impact and the cost associated with the incidents that they incur. Just as those are broken down, detection and escalation, we say, is activities that enable the company to notify, activities that enable them to detect the breach itself and report it to the appropriate personnel. That in and of itself, if you're talking about a breach of customer records, can be a very challenging process and a very costly process. It is, it's emotive when you're telling somebody that their data has been compromised, or indeed that there's a risk it's been compromised. The overhead of increased volumes to call centers, of engaging with PR firms, of generating mail shots, and the sorts of things that these organizations have needed to do historically because it was the right thing to do, and now are mandated to do by regulation, is not to be sniffed at by any stretch. Post-data breach response, really, the actual investigation of an incident to redress and repatriation and legal fines and the various costs that might be levied. We see that that area is probably where we have the greatest variance. So organizations who are in a highly regulated industry invariably are going to have a greater post-data breach cost associated with fines principally, or potentially that because they're regulated, they have to do a better job of responding. They can't just sweep it under the carpet. They are obliged to notify impacted customers. They are obliged to report to various authorities and answer their questions, all of which is going to generate additional cost and challenges to that organization. And the lost business one, this is one of the areas where the trickle really occurs. You have a direct loss of business, an inability to perform your day-to-day function for the short term of an incident or as a direct result. And then over time, that trickle-on effect of lost business, lost opportunities, business disruption, system downtime, etc., which ultimately, if you've lost customers, additional cost of new customer acquisition and efforts that might need to be undertaken to remedy the loss of faith in your customer base. As I say, that really does trickle on for years. A third of breach costs occur more than a year after the breach itself. 11% occur more than 2 years out. And again, I alluded to highly regulated industries. Those which are highly regulated have potentially, I think it's 48% of costs occur after the first year. So we're talking about the skew that is applied to the data by the likelihood of a significant fine. And that's why, as I talk to recommendations and what organizations do to remedy this issue, you'll see that a lot of it is not about preventing it from happening. There's an acceptance that you're likely to be compromised, but it's how you manage it and your ability to manage regulators and your reporting obligations that will really define, if you're in a highly regulated industry, what the impact is likely to be. Specifically as it relates to the finance and insurance sector, it is the most attacked industry now 4 years in a row. And spoiler alert for the 2020 report that's coming out, word on the street is that trend continues. So we're not expecting a change in that regard. This is across a number of industries that industry segments we chop up. Of course, you are paired up with the wider finance industry there. So I think they suffer very much because of the direct cost. So the function of a breach and the function of compromise of those, particularly as Darren was alluding to earlier, compromise and attacks against applications for direct financial benefit, for instance, really do ramp up the immediate cost. and then it's a regulated industry, which over a period of time means that they kind of get the 1-2 punch of potentially having significant fines and significant reporting obligations after that fact. That represented 17% of total attacks and incidents in 2019. One observation is, the most attacked sector, but actually not, the highest cost of a data breach, which does kind of indicate that there is a higher likelihood in that sector that that incidents will be handled better than health, where we saw the highest cost of a data breach. So that's the sort of the two key issues. You're being targeted the most, but there's a greater likelihood that those incidents, or a significant proportion, are being combated well enough before they become a major incident. But that's the difference between an incident and a data breach. Someone attempting or someone attacking you versus being successful in gaining access, and then successful in their ultimate goal. And particularly as I talk to the trends and how things are moving with a longer dwell time, a longer time that attackers are within infrastructure, the ability to detect and remove people, malicious actors, before they succeed in their goals is huge in modifying the actual impact of an incident on a business. I'm not going to dwell on this slide particularly. It is pulled directly from our report, but it does show immediately some quick wins. Having an incident response team, having an incident response plan and testing it, use of encryption, and having good business continuity management. And this is a huge one that's often overlooked. The ability to investigate an incident is key, but more so, or equally so, when we talk to the types of attacks I'm about to cover, destructive attacks and ransomware, the ability for business to continue as usual is going to minimize that direct financial impact. So having business continuity plans and a business continuity management process in place has a very significant impact. On the other end, those which had the greatest negative impact or increased the cost associated with a data breach, complex systems, extensive cloud migration. So if this is happening at a time or as part of a cloud migration, then there's a significant likelihood that it is, the cloud migration, the fact that the data is being moved to the cloud, will have had an impact on the cost of the data breach. So it's a risky time when you're doing major projects, when you are migrating to to new technologies, to things that might not be well understood within an organization. And of course, as we bring the focus to the present day and COVID, this is a time when a lot of those sorts of projects are being accelerated. This table and a huge amount of associated analysis are all available in the cost of a data breach report. So if it's a particular topic of interest, it's definitely worth having a fuller read there. And as I alluded to earlier, one of the things I wanted to focus on here is the major threats which are causing concerns to businesses, and rightly so, on the basis of the data that we've got. Destructive malware is on the rise. We saw this was July, December 2018 into January, July 2019, i.e. the last snapshots that we had for the 2019 report. We saw a 200% increase in destructive malware incidents. And in the same time, we saw a 116% increase in ransomware attacks. So the difference there, a destructive malware attack and a ransomware attack can present in a very similar manner. Often it's the same sorts of things happening to the organization. They don't have an ability to access data. They don't have an ability to conduct business because their systems have been impacted. But the differentiator really there is whether or not there is any intention that you will be able to recover. In a destructive attack, then you're talking about attackers, malicious actors who explicitly are trying to do damage, have no intention of eliciting a ransom from you and reversing the impacts in the event that you pay the ransom. Or also there is a grey area here, which is to say ransomware attacks which are conducted so badly and by such incompetent attackers that they destroy everything, and even if you do pay the ransom, you're not able to recover your regular systems and operation. Versus ransomware attacks, which is the topic of the second half of this talk, whereby it's it's been in the news a lot. I think a lot of people might think it's a relatively new phenomenon. It certainly isn't, but it is definitely on the up and up. And year on year, for the last 5 years, we've seen a significant increase in the volume of ransomware attacks that we've had, or we've seen and had to respond to. Here, the stats that we've quoted saying that the ransomware engagements we've looked into have come from 12 different countries, 5 different continents, and 13 different industries. It is not, the people perpetrating these attacks are often not picky. But what I'll speak to in a second is the fact that we are seeing a trend towards being slightly more targeted, which does narrow the focus a little bit. Organizations with a greater likelihood of an ability to pay, with a greater likelihood to be using certain technologies where a ransomware attack might be more effective, are more likely to be targeted. Europe, US, Middle East, all growing in numbers in the observed ransomware attacks that we see. Very quickly, I want to just cover a potted history just to set that scene. The first attack that is commonly referred to as a ransomware attack was the 1989 AIDS Trojan, whereby Joseph Pop distributed 20,000 disks, literally floppy disks, that he sent out to people researching HIV/AIDS. So other researchers, he was a researcher himself. And essentially the ransomware sat there after it had been executed, after they plugged the disk in. It sat there for 90 days, and then it started to encrypt file names and renamed folders, moved data, and asked for a ransom to be paid for it to be reversed. It wasn't reversible. It was just malice that occurred, and then maybe you paid the ransom, but you weren't going to recover from it. Other key points in ransomware history, which hopefully tell the story as to how they've evolved, how attackers have evolved, is as we move through, 2005 was a major one where we saw the first use of asymmetric encryption. So actual genuine encryption used, which could be reversed if you paid the ransom. As we look to Reviton, we saw the first evidence of extortion, which is another trend we are very much seeing in the last year or so. So in that case, it impersonated law enforcement, impersonated the FBI, and said, we found things on your computer that shouldn't be there, pay this fine. CryptoLocker was an example of Bitcoin being used as a payment mechanism. Before then, generally speaking, it was wire money here to this compromised bank account, or send a money transfer by different mechanisms. But this was where we started to see cryptocurrency employed in these attacks. And that, of course, has been a theme ever since. Don't want to go through each of these, but as we progress through some of the key spots we've seen, TeslaCrypt, Chimera, and Low Level 4 around 2015, we started to see domain compromise predicated attacks. So this is a trend whereby the networks of the organizations are compromised first, and then ransomware is dropped rather than it coming directly in via email. We saw in 2016 Jigsaw, a time-based deletion, where essentially it popped up with the character from Saw and said, you have 5 minutes for the next file to be deleted, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and it upped the ante and tried to pressure people into paying quickly. Again, trends that we see now in ransomware attacks. Moving through to WannaCry, NotPetya, probably one 2017 put a lot on people's radars. As far as ransomware was concerned, that is an example of, in WannaCry, ransomware that escaped. It was a single vulnerability being unpatched. A huge swathes of the internet were impacted, including, of course, the NHS. And NotPetya was a destructive attack, very similar to the Petya ransomware attack. However, it was determined that it was not, you were not meant to be able to recover had your system been compromised. And cryptocurrency mining malware, again, in 2017 was huge. It was the reason it's listed there, that's not ransomware, but it was a deviation from what we'd seen historically. Very quickly, just to those three trends, the evolution of ransomware. So victim targeting is definitely a hot topic. So historically, opportunism was common. You would have drive-by downloads, malicious websites you visit causing you to be compromised, phishing attacks, phishing campaigns targeting hundreds of thousands and individuals and some businesses being impacted. But we've seen increased sophistication. So in the case of WannaCry, we saw the worm capability, the ability to self-propagate, to transfer from machine to machine, which is how and why it went global. And we now see targeting of victims, explicitly going after businesses who are most likely to be able to pay. They're having a full domain compromise, full network compromise, possibly for a period of time, up to 6 months. I've seen instances of the network being compromised, and then they drop ransomware, making sure to hit the most key assets, making sure to take out backups. Some of that is via access resale. So maybe one group hacks into your network and they then sell the access to another group who actually use it for ransomware drop. As I said earlier, the cryptocurrency mining malware is not ransomware, but has a very interesting correlation. So as we've seen cryptocurrency mining malware increase, it was a mechanism by which threat groups could use to generate funds. Then we also saw ransomware decrease, because it's a lot of the groups perpetrating this. And if the value of Bitcoin, if the value of other cryptocurrencies is high, then we see a trend up towards cryptocurrency mining malware. Of course, 2017, may or may not recall, was the absolute boom in the price of cryptocurrencies, and that was where we saw a huge trend. It was the first time in a number of years where the majority of incidents I was investigating were not ransomware for a change. Now they were cryptocurrency mining malware. Either people compromising websites such that every visitor would mine cryptocurrency for them, or people compromising networks and systems and spinning up cryptocurrency mining software on those assets. Relatively easy to detect. We didn't see much evidence or much trend for data theft during these attacks, because all they would do is break into a network and run their software, and it was generating money for them. They didn't have to adversely impact the business. In fact, if they didn't, then it was more likely that the software would be left running for a period of time. So these were relatively low impact, but the bad guys are still making their money. The problem is, as soon as we saw the price of cryptocurrencies plummet, they went back to their old tactics, moving into ransomware again, and we saw less and less cryptocurrency mining malware. That said, we have a trend in the other direction very slowly as we've seen the price increase. And this is the final one I want to touch on, is extortion tactics. And we've seen this very heavily of late. It is in the news. I think there's an article there from the 12th of May. It's not new. I alluded to those two examples historically, but what we have now is the use of extortion having stolen data. So the threat actors are compromising networks. They're spending X number of months stealing data, getting an understanding of what the key assets are, and then dropping ransomware. And because organizations got used to ransomware, got an understanding that they needed to have backups and they could just restore, we see groups like Maze and Revil, who are not just extorting you to recover your infrastructure. They're now saying, oh, also, if you don't pay the ransom, we'll release your client's data. And in the case of the law firm here, I think you may have seen the news. It was documents pertaining to Lady Gaga's legal dealings had been leaked as part of that. And likewise, the Maze team literally have press releases that they push out, a blog where they publish a list of organizations they've compromised, samples of the data they've got, and threats to release that. Very briefly on the recommendations front, these are relatively generic, and a lot of them tie in with what Darren was touching on. So the use of multi-factor authentication is a key defense for any organization. Anything that's internet facing, a simple username and password can be compromised, and that's access granted, game over. We see it very common in business email compromise cases. Multi-factor authentication is a great defense against that. 2 and 3 there. Building an instant, 2 and 4, I should say, building an instant response team, having a capability I already alluded to earlier, was the most significant way to decrease the cost of an incident. And second only to that is the use of tabletop cyber ranges, different processes to test that same setup. So it's one thing to build it, but it's another to put it through its paces and make sure that it's actually capable of doing what you need it to do. Ensure there's a solution in place to detect spoof domains. That very much ties into those business email compromise, to that, the phishing attack theme that we see as the primary vector by which organizations are being compromised. But equally, the ability to detect the fact that your domain is being spoofed or that someone is trying to impersonate you allows you to protect yourself, your customers, right at the very outset. You know, potentially before the attack has been launched, you're recognizing and identifying that someone is building up to it or someone is planning an attack. So that's one of the earliest possible methods by which you can identify an attack incoming. And the use of threat intelligence to understand what the threats are to your business, what is impacting your sector, what is impacting your industry, such that you can design your defenses, you can target your investment in a manner that's strategic and makes sense against the threats that you're going to be facing. That was a decidedly whistle-stop tour, and if there are any questions, please fire them across via the messaging process. And I think we're moving to a question and answer section as the last part today.
Thank you very much, Adam. Obviously, ransomware is an incredibly complex solution, and it does raise an enormous number of questions. And we've had some questions in from the audience already today. I will hand across to Fran Howarth now. Fran is the security practice lead for Bloor Research, so it's her role to discuss and engage with organisations around what's going on in their security world. So Fran, I'll hand the microphone across to you.
Thank you, AJ. I'd like to start off by pointing a specific question at you, Darren, please. In your recommendations, you point to the NIST cybersecurity framework. But in Europe, the ISO 27001 and that series are extremely popular, and many of the insurers here will have implemented that. Would you recommend NIST over ISO? And what would you say to organizations who have already pursued ISO? Okay, Darren, could you unmute, please?
Sorry about that. So in principle, there are two different standards, really. NIST is a cybersecurity framework, and ISO is an information security framework. So it really depends what you're trying to address. A lot of the things, the data points that I spoke about earlier, would be cybersecurity related, and that's really why the recommendation around NIST. But saying that, there are overlaps. Absolutely, there's overlaps in terms of the controlled environment within both standards. And NIST is sort of commonly used across the financial services sector. The European Central Bank, for example, would use NIST as their baseline assessment standard rather than ISO 27001. If an organization is already went through ISO 27001, fantastic, and if they have a broad scope on that, even better. But I also would point them towards NIST in terms of looking at a more mature cybersecurity position to try and uplift maybe what they've got currently from ISO 27001.
Okay, thank you. And Adam, I'd like to ask you a question, please. Throughout these presentations, you've both mentioned where there are many problems are, and you've given some pointers as to what to do, but it really is quite a list. If you have to prioritize 3 areas, what would you suggest that your customers should look at first?
Thanks, Fran. So, in general terms, I think the cash reward, the greatest impact in the event of a breach, and that's one of the things that I should have alluded to in when I was speaking to those slides. Bear in mind that's organisations who have suffered a breach. So, in the event that you have an incident, having an incident response plan and an incident response team are going to be the very greatest drivers to protecting yourself and recovering from that in the most expedient and essentially the manner which is going to save the business the most money. So that would be kind of priority number 1. Second to that is detection. If we saw that an incident that occurs over a long period of time is going to have greater financial impact on a business. So the ability to detect when that's occurring, be that via any of a myriad of mechanisms. But it's one thing to have a firewall in place, to have your block, your protective wall around the organization. But if we assume that has failed, what have we got inside the organization to identify that it has? And network monitoring is probably the best bang for buck as far as an ability to have a baseline of what looks normal on network traffic within the organization, what you expect, and then highlighting any anomalous activity, which may well be malicious actors having gained access. And when I talk to ransomware attacks, cost, the idea that they might sit on your network for 3 months scouting out before they actually have the major impact, they drop the ransomware, they cause you concern. The idea that you could identify it early and kick them out is, that is the single greatest way you're going to reduce the impact of that incident. And we've worked many cases where that is the case, where a business has identified that something's going on, and we've caught them as they've been staging ready for ransomware. And then user awareness. I mean, that's a go-to as the third one. The ability for your users to identify a phishing email, the ability for your users to feel empowered and to report incidents when they occur is going to be key to making sure that you have that human detection mechanism working as effectively as it can.
Great, thank you. We haven't got much time left, so I'm going to leave you with one last question, which is to both you, Adam, and to Darren. We've been hearing about this pandemic that we're all living under. What are your customers saying? What are the hottest topics, like AJ mentioned, the hasty move to the cloud, or is it phishing? What is the greatest impact that you're seeing?
Adam, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, certainly. I think two key things. One is not an increase in anything, but the phishing attacks that we saw anyway will leverage what is in the news and what's emotive and what might fool someone into clicking something quickly. So there's definitely been a COVID bent to phishing attacks that we've seen. And then exactly as Darren alluded to during his talk, the sharp move to the cloud, the quick adoption or the hasty probably adoption of new technologies, which weren't used by the business before, it's not a recipe for disaster, but if you're not doing that with a very significant consideration to the security implications, is a route by which we see mistakes being made ultimately, and potentially that leading to compromise.
Yeah, I would echo that absolutely. But we have also seen a lot of additional services coming online as a part of this sort of move to work from home. A lot of Citrix services, for example, we've seen come online, and additional web-facing services. But unfortunately, we have seen an increase in these being insecure. So they're it's probably not surprising they're being brought on quite rapidly, and maybe they're just not getting the focus really when it comes to security, because the focus is to get them deployed and get people working as quick as possible. So we certainly have seen an increase in that. We've also seen an increase in terms of similar domain names being registered for particular companies. And again, these are used in phishing type attacks. It's not uncommon for someone to get an email and just sort of glance at the domain name, and it looks like Microsoft.com, for example. In a lot of cases, it's a misspelled domain name, and that can cause somebody to trust that email when really they shouldn't. So again, we've seen an increase in that.
Well, thank you both. We are now out of time, so I'm going to hand back to AJ to close up, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Fran. Well, thank you to everyone for attending today. We hope you found the information useful. Big thank you to our speakers, as always, for sharing their industry knowledge with us, and to Fran for hosting the Q&A. And once again, a big thank you to Brian for organising this from in the Insurance Tech Forums. We will be contacting you afterwards with some backup information and follow-on information from the webinar. If you have any questions, you'll be able to pose them to us directly. And we have just some information about some of the offers that are available to you from North Door to try and assist you with any issues, concerns, and worries you have around cybersecurity. But I say a big thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you for listening, and we will follow up with another presentation with Brian in the next few weeks. Thanks ever so much.